I'll comb in my hair now and wondering what dress to wear now. I said a little prayer for you. Forever, forever, you stay in my heart and I will love you forever, ever. What part of how love it together. That's how it must be to live without you. Would only be heartbreak for me. I run for the bus stand, but while riding I think of us days. I say a little prayer for you. At work I just take time, and all through my coffee break time, I say a little prayer for you. Forever, ever, stay in my heart and I will love you forever, ever. Love you together. That's how it must be to live without you. Would only be heartbreak for me. Nobody but me. Forever, ever, stay in my heart and I will love you forever, ever. Love you together. That's how it must be to live without you. Would only be heartbreak for me. My darling, believe me. For me there is no one but you. Please love me true. I'm in love with you. Answer my prayer. Answer my prayer, baby. Answer my prayer. Say you love me true. Answer my prayer. Answer my prayer, baby. Answer my prayer. Yeah. Darling, believe me. For me there is no one but you. Please love me true. This is my prayer. Answer my prayer now, baby. Answer my prayer. This is my prayer. Answer it right now, baby. Answer my prayer. Say you love me true. Answer my prayer. This is my prayer, baby. Answer my prayer. I'm in love with you.
Well, good morning. Welcome to Madam Whip-Ass Reads Inside the Mind of BTK. We are at chapter 12. We are pretty much halfway through. So, chapter 12 begins as such. The mouse pad on my computer had grown alarmingly hot. Wait a minute. The mouse pad on my computer had grown alarmingly hot, so I shut the machine down for a few moments to let it cool off. If only I could do the same thing for my brain. I stared into the emptiness of my hotel room. The quiet at this hour of the night was deafening. Thoughts were swimming around inside me like a piranha. After a few moments, one of them surfaced, and it occurred to me that Dennis Rader and I had something in common. He, too, was a profiler. The difference was that he profiled in order to feed his appetite as a sexual predator. He reminded me of a lion out in the Serengeti, scanning the plains for prey, weak, lame, or old. Why work up a sweat by going after some young, swift antelope when he can find others much more vulnerable? Yet the comparison only went so far because lions hunt for survival. They kill to feed themselves and their cubs. Men like Raider kill as a form of recreation. They're predators. They live for the hunt. Like the lion, they search for easy targets, but their biggest turn on is the chance to play God, to have the absolute control and dominance over another human being. It was enough to make me sick. That is, of course, if I didn't find it so goddamn interesting. The clock was ticking for Dennis Rader. Even if I had known the tragic, terrible outcome of his story, I had gained enough of an understanding about serial killers over the years to know that he had reached an age when there was no turning back. Even though he had yet to take a life, it was only a matter of time. Even though he told himself he was going to put his dark urges behind him, those urges were just too powerful, and growing stronger every day. Reading this portion of Rader's journal entries was like watching an impending train wreck. The year was 1970, shortly after Rader returned to Wichita following his 4-year hitch in the Air Force. His mother announced, "You need to come to church with me. I met a nice girl there who I think you'd like." She was right. Her name was Paula Dietz, and she graduated from Wichita Heights High School in 1966, the same year Rader went into service. Paula had grown up in a quiet little suburb of Wichita known as Park City. Physically, she was a wet dream come true for Rader, tall and blonde with brown eyes. She was a looker, he told one of my sources, but in a proper and sweet way. The two began dating shortly after meeting, and by 1971 they were married. Before long, they purchased a home in Park City that was practically next door to the house where Paula's parents lived. Rader wasn't in love, of course. Serial killers lack that ability, but they can fake it with the proficiency of a veteran actor. And Rader knew even then that having a wife was the honorable, normal thing to do. Having a wife, he no doubt sensed, would provide the perfect cover, allowing him to remain hidden and inconspicuous. By all accounts, Paula is a quiet, simple, hard-working woman. Her faith and her family are her passion. Even today, no one in the area will say a single disparaging word about her. In fact, people who know her basically refuse to say anything at all about her to strangers. Shielding her from the glare of inquisitive outsiders has become something of a community project. Yet, in this entire horribly distressing saga involving her husband, she has emerged as a truly fascinating character. One can't help but wonder, how was it that she could not know? Of course, only Paula holds the answer to that question. What is known is that on the surface, Dennis and Paula Rader were the picture of marital bliss. Friends have reported that Dennis could often be seen doting on his wife at church, opening and closing doors for her as she climbed in and out of the car, helping her on and off with her coat. During his interrogation, Rader admitted that he had real good sex with his wife, although he quickly confessed that their relationship would have been more fun if it was different, the sex. One thing seems clear. Marriage helped focus Rader. In 1972, he landed a job as an assembler at the Coleman Company and began to immerse himself in the goings on at Park City's newly created Christ Lutheran Church. Where Paula and her mother sang in the choir. By the summer of 1973, he was working on the assembly line at the Cessna Aircraft Company, which seemed perfect because Rader had reportedly begun toying with the idea of becoming a pilot. At the same time, he and Paula were trying to start a family, although they weren't having much luck yet. By November, the oil crisis was wreaking holy hell across the nation. Gasoline jumps from 30 cents a gallon to more than 50 cents. And every time he flipped on the TV, Rader had to listen to another news report about some plant laying off workers. It wouldn't happen to him, though. That's what he told himself. After all, he'd been so good. He tried so hard to stop thinking all those bad thoughts. And before long, though, he began hearing rumblings that the suits who sat around all day in their air-conditioned offices had panicked. And because of the huge jump in gas prices, they figured the small plane business was all washed up. So one crisp autumn morning, Rader showed up at the Cessna plant and learned that he and about 500 other workers had been sacked. He couldn't believe it. It wasn't fair. All because of some phony oil crisis cooked up by a bunch of guys living out in the desert. His head was spinning around. He felt as though someone had plunged a buck knife into his heart. Sure, he'd been working on the line for only 4 months, but he loved the job. The money was good. He was even taking night classes at Wichita State University. He felt like a person with a future. Now it had been destroyed. He climbed into his '62 Chevy Impala and poured on the gas out of the parking lot. He told himself that somebody was going to pay for making him feel so small, so powerless. The monster began to squirm inside him. Rader might have deluded himself that it was dead, but it turned out that it had always been in there, lying low, hibernating, gathering strength for the day it would one. Sorry, that was written kind of funny. The monster began to squirm inside him. Rader might have deluded himself that it was dead, but it turned out that it had always been in there, lying low, hibernating, gathering strength for the day it would one day reappear. Rader later told Landy that minutes after getting his pink slip, he realized he was on the verge of doing something weird, something bad. Paula wasn't home at that hour of the morning. She wouldn't return from a bookkeeping job at the VA hospital until late that afternoon. So Rader decided to just drive the streets of Wichita, trying to pretend he didn't know what was going to happen next. And when he finally spotted a house a few miles away from the Cessna plant that looked as though the owners were away, he stopped his car, strode up to the front door, and rang the doorbell. When no one answered, he walked into the backyard and broke inside. His heart was going crazy in his chest. Yet standing inside that stranger's empty home not only calmed him, but made him feel alive in a way he hadn't for years. He didn't stay long. When he finally left, he took only one thing with him: a hatchet. He walked straight back to his car, shoved it beneath the front seat, and drove home. He felt good. The next few weeks were bad ones. He couldn't shut off his head. The yearning to hurt someone wouldn't go away. He couldn't shake it. For years, he'd fantasized about this sort of thing, but this was different. The urge was so much more powerful now and was growing more so with each passing day. And now that he didn't have a job to occupy him, he had nothing to do all day but think. He couldn't control his urge if he wanted to. That was what he told himself. The thing was, he didn't want to control it anymore. Why should he? He'd done that all his life. He'd kept his secret under wraps. He'd hidden it away. He'd played by everybody's rules. And where had it gotten him? Out of work, living off his wife's salary and collecting unemployment, with Christmas just around the corner. Shortly before getting laid off, Raider decided to surprise Paula with a trip to Las Vegas. But after getting his pink slip, he didn't want to go. The people at the airline, however, didn't seem to care that he just lost his job, he later said. They weren't going to give him his money back, so he had no choice but to use the tickets. He told himself he'd make the best of it, and before long he began to wonder what Sin City would look like from the window of his jet. Those millions of flickering incandescent bulbs and miles of neon tubes setting the night sky aglow. Yet, on the evening they flew into Las Vegas, all he saw was darkness. There must be some mistake, he thought. Had their flight been diverted to another city? When he asked the stewardess about it, she just shrugged. It was all because of the oil shortage, she told him. A couple of days before, they decided to turn off all the lights in town because they had gotten too expensive to power them. Raider stared down at the blackened city in angry disbelief. He never wrote another word about the trip in his diary, so I can only imagine that his visit to Vegas was both uneventful and disappointing. A few days later, he returned to their tiny house in Park City in a foul, anxious mood. Every morning, he'd drive Paula to work and then return home to thumb through the stash of detective magazines he kept hidden away on a top shelf of the guest bedroom closet. He loved to stare into those pages, reading the stories over and over again, pausing every so often, allowing the headlines to seep inside him. He was into kinky sex and kinkier kills, weird case of the hog-tied hookers, rape stranglers, 2-year terror reign, dog leash strangler hung victim from doorknob. The autopsy showed that besides hog-tying his victims, the pervert used his torture kit on Krista. Raider would close his eyes and masturbate, imagining himself to be right there in the middle of whatever scene he just read about. He'd always be the bad guy, and he loved the way the women in those magazines would watch his every move, the way their little eyeballs would dart about in their sockets, never blinking, following him as he walked about the room with his ropes and knives. He was the one with all the power, all the control, and there was no denying that. He was in charge. It was sheer ecstasy. He couldn't get enough of it. Winter came early that year. The ground froze up hard as concrete, and the sky always looked gray. Paula was the one bringing home the bacon now. Raider didn't like thinking about that. It made him feel weak. Some mornings after dropping Paula off at work, he'd write in his journal, something he continued to do on an erratic basis for the remainder of his life as a free man. Lately, his entries, which begun to detail his newfound habit of driving the streets of Wichita, allowing his mind to drift from one dark thought to the next. He began noticing things in a way he never had before. Coeds from the local university, mothers and little girls, women walking by themselves on the sidewalk. They were all for the taking, he told himself, and that made him feel good. Sometimes he'd park his car and watch them stroll past his window. Other times, he'd follow them home, paying close attention to where they lived. Up until then, he'd always felt somewhat ashamed of all those thoughts he used to have, but something was different now. The gloves were off. He was sick of pretending. There was a comfort that came with all this thinking, a sense of belonging, of being part of a universe where he called the shots. He didn't need to hide his thoughts and feelings anymore to be embarrassed. He could go for hours at a stretch and not do anything but let that TV set between his ears play and play and play. Oh, the places it took him. One morning, after arriving back at the house, he pulled his old typewriter out of the closet in the back bedroom and rolled a piece of paper into it. Over the past few days, he'd been starting to notice that the buzz he got by looking at his magazines wasn't enough anymore. He began to grow bored reading all about the grand adventures all those other guys were having. He decided it might be nice to create a story of his own, one in which he, not somebody else, got to be the bad guy. He certainly never considered himself to be much of a writer, but now it seemed as though the words and sentences were bursting out of him so quickly that he wondered if he'd be able to peck them out on his typewriter quickly enough. It almost felt as though someone were dictating to him. According to an entry I read in his journal, the first time he tried it, he sat there for a moment, thought about what he wanted to write, what he needed to say. He'd never done that sort of thing before, yet he had so much going on inside his head that he needed to get out. So he started off by coming up with a title. If he could just get the right title, the rest of the story would come to him. So he typed out the words, "The child killer who dressed like a woman." I'll read it again because I read that correctly. So he typed out the words, "The child killer who dressed like a woman." Is he related to Andrew Caldwell? Okay, never mind. My mind just wandered. Sorry. What'd that fool say? Women, women, women. I'm in love with a woman. I'm not gay no more. Women, 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 women. All right, never mind. Oh, sorry. Okay, bring it back in. Something about the word women didn't look right to him, he later told my source, but he couldn't figure out why. Lord knows he had to be one of the world's worst spellers. Nevertheless, he liked the way his headline floated there at the top of the page. It looked professional, he told himself. Then all at once the story he needed to write exploded inside his brain. He began typing. Get a load of this, y'all. We're about to read his first story. It was supper time in Wichita, Kansas. The streets were nearly deserted. The scene presented peaceful winter setting for two young girls walking down the street. There was no reason for concern as the two girls walked along happy with Christmas thought only a few days away. By the way, y'all, I'm reading it as it is written. And neither girls noticed the yellow two-door Chevy following them. Inside the Chevy, a woman or someone dressed like a woman peered nervously from the steering wheel and fingered the cold steel handcuff on the seat next to her. Inside her pantsuit, a small revolver was cocked and fitted with a silent tear. He meant silencer. She adjusted her sunglasses and moved forward towards the girls. When the girls reached the corner of the street, she pulled up and rolled the, the window down. Girls, do want to ride up the street? The two girls looked at each other for the answer, but since this was a woman driving, they felt that no harm would come to them. Sure, they both answered at about the same time and slid in. Jessica reached out and shut the door, and the car sped away. The story was cataloged on a disk in my computer. Rader's creation went on for 4 single-space pages. He had yet to finish page 1 when his main character pulled a pistol out from his waistband and thrust it against Amelia's temple. Rader wrote that the killer commanded her in a gruff voice to fasten a pair of handcuffs around her friend's wrist, then fasten the other cuff around her wrist. The car sped off into the darkness that was dropping over the city like a shroud. Next stop, a deserted farm on the edge of town. Neither girl uttered a word during the drive. They both knew they'd been tricked by the man who dressed like a woman. Eventually, the group ended up inside a dusty old tack room located in a corner of an empty barn. The two girls were chained to a post. Next, Rader had his cross-dressing main character retrieve a suitcase from the trunk of his car. From it, he pulled a hemp rope. The girls were seated on a hay bale, whimpering, while the man went into the main part of the barn and tied a slip knot in the rope and threw the other end over a thick wooden beam. He watched as the rope dangled in space, 6 feet above the hard-packed dirt floor, then returned to the tack room clutching a knife and ordered Amelia to remove her clothes. Rader wrote that the girl froze with fear, but the sharp end of the knife persuaded her to do as she was told. He placed a red gag in her mouth and bound her wrists with nylon cord. She began sobbing. He did the same thing to Jessica, then took pictures of the two frightened girls with his camera. Outside, a full moon hung in the dark sky. The man who dressed like a woman walked out to his car and fetched a shovel from his trunk. A moment later, he stood in a nearby field, awash in the incandescent glow of moonlight, and dug 2 3-foot deep holes in the cold Kansas earth, one beside the other. He returned the shovels to his trunk and wrapped it in a plastic bag, then grabbed the kerosene heater he brought with him and carried it into the tack room to make it warm for the two shivering girls. He unchained Amelia and marched her into the barn, prodding her with the tip of his knife. But she couldn't see the rope he prepared for her because of the darkness. And after forcing the trembling child onto the ground, he tied her ankles together and pulled the slip knot over her head. Fear then struck her, and she twisted in her rope and cried, he wrote. She was still struggling to get free when he carried her over to the hay bale and drew the slack rope tight. She froze with fear and closed her eyes as he dropped his pants, wrapped her panties around his penis, then kicked the hay bale out from beneath her. Excuse me. Excuse me.
Help me drive on. Help me drive on. Help me drive. Help me drive. Help me drive on. Help me drive on.
Instantly, her head turned slightly upward and to the side. Her legs kicked, her body twitched. The killer took a few pictures of her swinging back and forth in the cold barn. Then he cut her down and carried her warm corpse out to the grave he just dug. Before rolling her into the hole, he removed Amelia's blouse and training bra. By the end of the story, the killer, who dressed like a woman, encircled a loop of baling wire around Jessica's throat and ordered her to perform fellatio on him. Suck badly on it, real hard, Rada wrote. Do you understand me? Pronto, he screamed. Oh, Jesus Christ. Eventually, the killer garroted the girl, marveling at how her face became bloated with blood and the wire buried itself beneath her flesh. He tossed into the grave beside her friend, tidied up the barn, then drove home. A few days later, after reading about the disappearance of the two girls in the newspaper, he was able to track down where their parents lived. The killer mailed them their daughter's panties, which he enclosed with a little note. Merry Christmas to you all, Rada wrote. As the letter went on to say, he hoped this small present of goodwill will brighten your day up, for now you know that the girl is not in her pants. So where is she? Have a good day. As an extra touch, Rada had his main character sign his letter with 4 capital letters: DTPG, which stood for Death to Pretty Girls. End of story. All right. If you don't mind, I just need to play a song. If you don't mind. Yeah. Let's do this one.
Some of you young folks been saying to me, hey, Pops, what you mean? What a wonderful world. How about all them wars all over the place? You call them wonderful? And how about hunger and pollution? They ain't so wonderful either. But how about listening to old Pops for a minute? Seems to me it ain't the world that's so bad, but what we are doing to it. And all I'm saying is see what a wonderful world it would be if only we'd give it a chance. Love, baby, love. That's the secret. Yeah. If lots more of us loved each other, we'd solve lots more problems. And man, this world would be a desert. That's why old Pops keeps saying, I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day, the dark sacred night. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, "How do you do?" They're really saying, "I love you." I hear babies cry, I watch them grow. They learn much more than I never knew. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful
Okay. I don't know about you, but I need that in my life right now is we are reading and I'm reading and you are listening to what's inside the mind of BTK. It's hell in that mind. It's devilish in that mind. It's demonic in that mind. And so I got to hear some peaceful things, some peaceful words, and some down home Holy Ghost driving the devil away gospel music. Because that's what's going to help me get through this. All right. Over the next few days, Rada mused in his journal about his curiosity over what it would be like to take that next step. True, he often thought about that sort of thing, but now he was fantasizing about it in a different way. It all seemed so within the realm of possibility now, so close to happening. As if he'd have to do, as if all he'd have to do is reach out his hand. He could wrap his fingers around it and squeeze. It was his for the taking now. His entire life had prepared him for this moment. All those drawings he'd been making since he was a kid, all those daydreams, all those cats and dogs out in the barn. The fire inside him seemed to be growing hotter, igniting everything around it. Such a fine line seemed to exist between creating a fantasy in his head and unleashing one in real life. Christmas came and went. None of the things he used to do could put out that fire now. He never wanted something so badly before. He crept up to the edge of the abyss and peered over it so many times that he told himself he was finally ready now. All he needed was the right situation, and he'd know exactly what to do and how to do it. According to his journal, one night after Paula went to sleep, he crept out of the house and drove into the sticks, parked his car, and walked to an all-night grocery. He pretended to be talking on the telephone, but he was really studying women who wandered into the store and then emerged a few minutes later carrying a sack or two of food. It was 11:30 by the time he finally spotted the woman he wanted. She parked her car in the corner of the lot and walked into the store. He waited for her to disappear inside, then hung up the phone and casually walked over to her vehicle and tried opening the back door. It wasn't locked. Only the Lord knew how desperately he wanted to climb inside and lie down on the floor in the shadows behind the front seat. He'd rehearsed it over and over again in his mind. Inside his head, it always played out the same way. She'd place her groceries in the front seat, start the car, and pull out onto the highway, and he'd surprise her by pressing his 22 caliber handgun against her temple. Drive out into the country, he yearned to order her. And once they arrived at that perfect spot he had in mind, he'd bind her, rape her, strangle her, and dump her body out into a culvert. But as he stood there in the parking lot of the market, he suddenly realized there were variables he'd never considered before that moment. What if she spotted him lying there and started screaming? What if she asked the clerk to help her load groceries into the car? He'd never get away with it, he told himself. So he walked back down the highway to his car and drove home. But that was hardly the end of it. He now understood that he needed to be much more systematic in his planning. If he was going to pull off a bold crime, he needed to anticipate every single worst case scenario imaginable. Nothing could be left to chance. All those guys he read about in the detective magazines, they might have pulled off big rapes, kidnappings, and mass murders, but they'd all gotten caught because of some foolish mistake. They were lazy. He vowed not to let that happen to him. He would be different. He was always an organized guy, a detail freak. He couldn't help himself. He was the type of guy who would walk into a room and want first thing to straighten it up, organize it, put everything back in order. Suddenly, it dawned on him that he could use this trait to his advantage. He used his love of order to help him kill. The devil, he thought, really was in the details. Oh, boy. So he spent the next few days plotting, fantasizing. After dropping Paula off at work each day, he began hanging out in the parking lot of the Twin Lakes Mall, he later confessed, studying the girls as they walked to and from their cars. He'd lose himself in his daydreams, shutting his eyes and trying to imagine all the powerful things he could do with victims. He wanted one so badly. One morning it came to him. He'd snatched the 30-something-year-old brunette he'd often seen walking across the parking lot, the one he knew worked in a bank located in the mall. I can do this, he told himself. I can do this. People kidnap people and hold them for ransom all the time. Rader knew, however, that he wasn't going to bother with any of that ransom nonsense. He'd bind her, force her to have sex with him, then garrote her. Afterward, he'd toss her body on the side of a highway outside of town. A few days earlier, he'd begun driving around with his bowling bag filled with his pistol, some ropes, and a hunting knife. He referred to the bag as his hit kit because that was the slang term that all those killers in his detective magazines used to describe the tools of their trade. According to the entry I read in his journal, it was early evening when he finally decided to make his move. The brunette always seemed to depart the bank about 5:35 p.m. and walk to her car. So he left his car on the other side of the parking lot, walked across to where she parked, and waited. When she appeared, he pulled the hood of his Parker down over his head, walked up to her and grabbed her, which was how everyone seemed to do it in the pages of his detective magazines. But everything went wrong. The moment he laid his hands on her, she began screaming and punching at him, and he couldn't control her arms. She'd gone insane on him. He didn't realize that a woman could be so strong, so he shoved her down onto the asphalt and ran the hell back toward his car. That was a big mistake, he muttered to himself while heading back home to Park City. Okay, that's enough for me. That's only chapter 12. I usually read 2 or 3 chapters. Not today, Satan, not today. Thank you for tuning in. And let's listen to Aretha Franklin again. Peace.
holy, holy. Holy, 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 holy. Love right now, love, brother.